Hello, so I'm doing my presentation over Jane Eyre, and my paper is titled Jane Eyre, a Victorian Heroine with Medieval Wings. Right here is my figure 1. It's a quote from Jane Eyre found in our books on page 228. It's a very famous quote. It is, "I am no bird and no net ensnares me." It's a huge quote in relation to fairy idealism that's explored in this book, so I felt like it'd be a really good contribution to this presentation. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to talk about a look into the paper. So my paper is about the fairy tropes that are used in Jane Eyre, and it really explores how Jane Eyre is depicted as a fairy, but not as a Victorian fairy. She's depicted more as a medieval fairy, so I talk about like the origins of the fairies, and I use all these medieval texts to compare and contrast, and basically just to prove my argument that she is medieval and not Victorian. So my thesis is, by recultivating the mischievous and sexually powerful pre-Christian fairy, Bronte's female hero succeeds in challenging stereotypes about Victorian women. So down here you can find my points and my arguments, and so how I talked about how Jane is a fairy. This right here, these are the Tuatha De Danann. These are the original fairies. So this is a really strong point in my paper. This is where I introduce the fairies and where they came from. And so these beings were the origin of Celtic folklore. This is where all fairies come from. They were the Tuatha De Danann, and then they transitioned into the fairies of the Mound. And then I introduced the medieval texts that I use to prove how Jane is medieval and not Victorian, but they all go back to the Tuatha De Danann and the fairies of the Mound. So the first text that I used for medieval texts, I use the Canterbury Tales. Specifically, I focus on the Wife of Bath's tale and going back to my thesis and how she succeeds in challenging stereotypes. So both of these tales, Jane Eyre and Wife of Bath's tale, they're both about female empowerment, and they just very much correlate with one another. They both talk about fairies. They have quotes in them that are uncannily similar, and they have a strong bond that forms like a bridge to understanding. And then I used A Midsummer Night's Dream and Lamble. So Midsummer Night's Dream is actually Elizabethan and Lamble is medieval. These aspects focus on nature, so I explained how Jane was connected to the nature. That's a huge aspect in the story. So you can see that in A Midsummer's Night Dream. That's all about fairy tropes and how fairies are woodland creatures that meet in the woods, and they're connected to the nature and they meet by the moonlight. And then I further elaborated on this by introducing Lamble, because Lamble, that has a strong female lead in it, just like Jane Eyre, and it's also a love story. The female lead she's a fairy mistress, so she brings her lover Lamble to meet with her in fairyland by moonlight, by the nature. She'll only meet with him in nature. So Jane Eyre strongly correlates with that story and with A Midsummer's Night Dream. And then I also use Sir Orfeo, going back to the fairyland aspect. Sir Orfeo is also medieval text. It's about fairies and how a man loses his wife to the fairy king, and he has to go and save her in fairyland, and it refers to the land of the dead. So I have a quote at the top that I'll go back to so I can reference that, but Jane Eyre 100% uses this connotation and uses the same exact example, especially like when she goes to visit her dying aunt at Gateshead, and then she comes back and Rochester says to her, he says, where is it at? He says to her, "She comes from the other world, from the abode of people who are dead, you elf." And that's found on page 220. So that's how these stories correlate. I also use this down here. This was this right here had to do with how medieval fairies do not depict what Victorian fairies depicted. So this is a drawing by Arthur Rockham. This is of a Victorian fairy. You can see how they're infantilized and they're sexually objectified even. You see she's naked. They're treated as objects though, and they don't have the same amount of freedom and especially around gender expectations as the medieval fairies did. So my paper proves that Jane Eyre is not a Victorian fairy, she's a medieval fairy, and this was a pretty strong point in my paper. I talked about how the infantilized portrayal of fairies contributes to the loss of the mystique and potency of medieval fairies as symbols of nature's mysteries and human desires. And then to conclude, I just want to restate that Jane Eyre depicts a strong heroine that disrupts the preconceived notions about the women of this time. Charlotte Bronte combines real-life issues with supernatural entities that really opens the door and upends the Christian and patriarchal norms of Victorian society. So, this serves as commentary on the limitation imposed on women in Victorian society, and it acts as a revolutionary work of literature which transcends the boundaries of time and continues to captivate and provoke readers worldwide. So down here, I included the meeting between Jane and Rochester for the first time. This is like where the fairy references very first start in Jane Eyre, and I thought that was really important, so it's a clip from the movie. And then down here, I included this Jane Eyre book from, it's Pluton who published it, and I like how in the picture, the trees behind her look like wings, because it alludes to the fairy stuff, the fairy tropes that are used in Jane Eyre. And then I also included a quiz to find out if you're a fairy too, to see if you would fit this Jane Eyre fairy depiction. And thank you.